In this video, we'll take a look at drawing an owl with pastel pencils. We'll begin by drawing very lightly with an HB pencil on gray drawing paper. We'll just be concerned with the basic shapes of the owl here. We'll develop the details with the pastel pencils. It's okay to draw several lines as we're trying to find the correct shape of the owl. Marks made with the HB pencil are extremely light. We don't want the graphite to interfere with the subsequent applications of pastel. We're also considering the balance between the positive and negative spaces within the composition. For this reason, we'll place the owl just slightly right of center. This will make for a more dynamic and interesting composition. We'll go ahead and loosely sketch out the locations of the eye and the beak of the owl, and then we'll lightly erase any of the stray lines. We can revisit these locations with the HB pencil being a bit more precise this time. We'll record the areas of the pupils, and we'll leave a little bit of a space for highlights that will be put in later with the pastel pencil. Now, with minimal amounts of graphite on the surface, we can begin applying pastel pencils. For this demonstration, I'll be using a variety of different brands including Derwent, Conte A Paris, and General's Multi-Pastel pastel pencils. We'll begin with a flat yellow in the area around the pupils. Then, using a blending stomp, we can work this application into the tooth of the paper. Now we can begin to layer colors, which is one of the great things about pastels. We can layer multiple applications of colors affecting the value and the color and the depth of the color as well. We'll start with white, and then we'll use the blending stomp to work this application into the surface. Now with a bit of brown, we'll start to develop some of the darker values that exist on the top portions of the eyes. In this example, the top portions of the eyes are a bit shadowed. So we'll affect the value in this location using a brown initially, and then we'll use a bit of black later, but we'll do it very subtly with a blending stomp. For now, we'll go ahead and develop some of the dark areas that exist around the eyes themselves. We'll use a black for this. We'll put a very minimal application here, and then we'll work that application into the surface using the blending stomp. Of course, I shouldn't have to mention this, but one of the clear benefits to using pastel pencils is the control that you get applying the pastel material. Of course, it's still pastel material, allowing you to create multiple layers, as we see here, creating a lot of depth in the color and create a painterly image, but you have the control of a pencil, so you can go in there and create some very intricate details if so desired. Now that we've got a bit of the black material on the blending stomp, we can pull that into the upper portion of the eye, making the shadows a bit darker there. Now we'll continue to develop the depth within the eye, and this time we'll use a bit of orange over the top of the yellow application. And again, we'll work this application into the surface using the blending stomp. Now, throughout the drawing, we'll be using the blending stomp quite frequently to work the material into the tooth, creating a smoother application, but in certain locations, we'll allow the marks to sit there on the surface without any application by the blending stomp. We'll go ahead and darken in the pupils here using black. We'll leave a little bit of a space for the highlights, however. And then again, we'll apply the blending stomp, working the material into the surface, creating a smoother texture. Now with a white pastel pencil, we can start to address some of the highlights that happen on the upper portion of the eye. Now this particular highlight overlaps the pupil, entering the yellow area around the pupil. In most circumstances, no matter what type of eye you are drawing, you'll find that there are more highlights that exist in the eye, besides just the one that exists on the pupil. Many times these highlights are very subtle, so we'll add a couple of these using the white pastel pencil. Then we'll go back with another application of the orange just to create a bit more depth in the eye. We'll also do the same with a bit of yellow. Now we can begin to develop some of the colors and values that exist around the eyes. We started with the eyes in this demonstration because the eyes will be the focal point of the image. I typically like to start with a focal point and work outward from there. In this case, we'll start to pull some of the strokes outward with the white pastel pencil. This owl is rather furry, and these marks will help to communicate the furriness of the owl. With some of these initial marks on the surface, we can go back and refine some of the details in the dark areas around the eyes, again using the black pastel pencil. With a bit of the black pastel still on the blending stump, we can start to make a few marks that will indicate some of the darker undertones that exist underneath the white furry marks that we'll make later on top. We'll also push the values in these locations using a bit of dark brown over the top of these marks that we make. There's also a bit of a transition area coming outward from each eye. Again, we'll develop some of the darker values with the dark brown. Of course, we'll create multiple layered applications over the top of these dark areas, creating the lighter values that exist on top. So essentially, we're addressing some of the darker values that exist underneath the fur, and then we're making lighter marks over the top using the white pastel pencil. We'll go ahead and put a strong highlight on the very end of the beak, and then using the black pastel pencil, we'll start to develop some of the darker values. Then, of course, using the blending stump, we'll work some of these applications into the surface, creating a smoother transition from the strong highlight and the darker values that exist on the beak. Now with the white pastel pencil, we'll make the highlight a bit stronger, and then we can start to create some of those directional strokes that will create the illusion of the fur on the face of the owl. Again, we'll pull these strokes just as hair grows, right over the top of the darker values that we've established underneath. And of course, as we work, we can continually push the value relationships between the darks and the light. We can add darker values of brown or lighter values of brown as well. In this case, a bit of lighter brown exists around the outer edges of the eyes. This lighter brown also exists on the upper portion of the head as well. We can continually apply these subtle applications of color, these undertones, if you will, because when we apply the white applications over the top, some of the white pastel will mix with these colors, creating a more natural looking effect. A very slight yellow can be detected in these sections as well, so we'll make a very light application of yellow. Here, we'll darken up some of the values that exist on the lower portion of the face using a dark brown. And of course, there's a pattern that exists on the upper portion of the head, so we'll create this pattern again using the dark brown. We'll continue to develop some of the darker values. Again, remembering that we're going to apply lighter values over the top. And these applications will be mostly undertones that exist underneath the light applications. We'll start applying some of the white, but before we get too far with that application, we'll work some of the darker undertones in using a blending stump. As we work the material with the blending stump, we'll consider the blending stump to be a mark-making tool. It is, after all, a mark-making tool. So the strokes that are made with the blending stump should mimic the strokes made with the pastel pencil. A few more darker areas are addressed, this time with the black pastel, using a very light application. Black is an extremely strong color, so we should always use it in moderation. In many circumstances, we can avoid it completely, but in this case, the black is very important and must be used to develop some of the darker values. Now, before applying our white applications, we'll work the black and the darker applications in with the blending stump. Now with the white pastel pencil, we can begin the process of creating the illusion of the furry face. Again, we'll pull marks out in the direction that the hair grows on the face, overlapping the darker applications underneath. With any art-making material, patience is extremely important. Using pastel pencils is no different, Since we're layering multiple applications of color to create depth, interest, and realism in the piece, we should be patient in our process. Too often, people expect immediate results when they're using any art medium, when often they just need to simply slow down and spend a bit more time on the piece that they're creating. The easiest and simplest way to see immediate improvement from your artwork is to just dedicate more time to creating it. Work slowly and meticulously, and you'll see immediate results. Now at this point, we're going back with the white pastel pencil, filling in all of the areas in between the darker areas of value that we've created previously. Of course, we're considering the stroke that we make. The direction of the stroke does change in various locations around the face and the head of the owl. Some of the strokes are a bit longer depending on the length of the fur, and some are a bit shorter, of course, in areas where the fur is a bit shorter. You can see here that down underneath the beak, the strokes even become a bit horizontal. A few subtle changes in value exist throughout the fur. We'll use the blending stomp to create a few areas of darker value by applying a bit of black initially and then working that application in with the blending stomp. Then we'll go over the top of these applications again with the white pastel pencil, creating the illusion of fur. Now, of course, contrast, is important. So throughout the drawing, we'll be pushing the contrast. And when I'm talking about contrast, I'm specifically talking about the contrast in value. Value, of course, is the darkness or lightness of a color. We want to be sure that there's a full range of value, meaning that we have the darkest darks, the lightest lights, and the midtones and values in between. But of course, we want to have a strong contrast between the darks and the lights in various locations. For this reason, we'll continually push some of the values a bit darker and some of the values a bit lighter as we go to ensure that we have this full range and the necessary contrast to communicate the texture of the fur. Now, we've blocked in the shapes for the ears initially with the black, and then with a bit of light brown and of course the white pastel pencil. We can overlap some of these dark areas with white applications, creating the illusion of the fur in these areas. We'll also do the same thing around the eyes and just create a few stray marks indicating some of the fur overlap in these dark locations. Now, on either side of the body and the head of the bird, there's a slightly darker value. It's almost white, but not quite. For this reason, we'll apply beige initially. Then we'll go over the top of this application with black to create the pattern that exists on either side. Of course, we'll leave a little bit of space between each one of the marks that we create, and again, we'll consider the directional marks that are made. A bit of darker value exists just underneath the white strip underneath the beak of the bird as well. We'll create, again, a pattern in this location using the black, and then we'll work all of these applications in with the blending stomp. Using the blending stomp, we'll pull some of these darker applications up into the white area above. This will create a smoother transition between these sections. Then we can address some of the lighter values that exist in these sections by applying the white pastel. A variety of widths and lengths of line is used here, and again, the direction of the stroke is considered. With any representational drawing or painting, the elements of art and how they're arranged in the piece are ultimately the key to success. Of course, we're using a variety of different elements in this piece, including line, shape, color, value, and texture, and many of these elements rely on each other for their success. For texture specifically, it is the arrangement of the values that ultimately lead to the illusion of texture in the image. If we have the appropriate contrast between the dark values and the light values and the midtones as well, the illusion of texture is conveyed in the image. Of course, the directional strokes that we make are also important and play a role in creating the illusion of texture. We'll continue creating this illusion of texture by developing the darker values and then layering the lighter values on top, and then creating those directional strokes indicating the fur of the owl over the top of these darker values. Now it's time to address the lower portion of the owl. This portion is overall generally darker in value. This simply means that there's going to be a higher concentration of locations of darker value in this section. We'll initially address this section by creating the dark patterns with the black pastel pencil. We're leaving enough space in between to create lighter values. These locations of lighter value will be applied in between the sections that we leave and overlap the dark applications as well. But before we start to apply these lighter applications, we'll apply a bit of light brown in areas to create a bit more interest and depth in this lower portion. Then, using the blending stomp, we'll work this application into the surface, mixing the black and the light brown applications. Here again, we'll consider the directional strokes that are made with the blending stomp, ensuring that they flow in the same direction as the marks made with the pastel pencil. Then we're ready to start developing some of the lighter values by applying the white pastel pencil over the top. We'll leave adequate areas of darker value in between the light marks that are made. When you encounter a complex pattern or texture like we see here, it's easy to become overwhelmed. But if we simplify what we are seeing down into an easy step-by-step process, it makes it a bit easier. Here we simply layered darker values first, we added a bit of light brown to create some undertones, and then we're developing the lighter values on top. The relationship between the darker values and the lighter values is what results in the illusion of the texture and pattern that we're after. Of course, it also helps that when we layer the lighter white pastel over the top, some of the colors underneath mix, creating a more natural appearance. Now, as you probably can imagine, the pattern that I'm creating here is a very close match to what's observed on the subject. It's not an exact copy, nor will it ever be an exact copy. Our goal as artists, of course, is to create an illusion. And in a drawing, we create this illusion by mimicking the textures that we see in the subject. Of course, we use our subject to pick up clues on how we can create this illusion in the drawing, but it will never ever be an exact copy, and you should not let that hold you up when you're in the drawing process. Pick up clues from your subject and figure out a way that you can create the illusion in the drawing through the use of value, line, and color. Now that we've enhanced some of the contrast by going back into some of the darker areas with the black pastel pencil, we'll use the white pastel pencil to create some of the furry marks over the top of the darker locations. Again, we'll just pull strokes out in the direction that hair grows. By allowing these marks to overlap some of the darker locations, we create the necessary contrast to make them visible. Now it's time to consider the background, and of course we could always leave the gray of the paper as the background and not address it at all. There's enough contrast at this point in the drawing. However, I do want to accentuate the eyes of the owl, and for this reason we'll create a background that contrasts the color of the eyes. This means we'll make a background that is subtly purple, because the eyes of course are yellow and purple is the complement of yellow, so that will create a stronger sense of contrast. Now, instead of just using purple alone, we'll also use a bit of magenta and blue, since blue and magenta mix to create a purple. Then over the top of that application, we'll start to apply some of the white pastel. Of course, we'll allow the colors underneath to show through in areas, creating those undertones that we're after. A finger is used to move the material around on the surface, and as we do so, we'll consider the strokes that are made with the finger, as these will translate somewhat as brush strokes. We'll pull the material all the way up to the edge of the owl, and we'll clean up these edges once we've got all of our background applications in place. Now it's up to you how far you want to take the undertones that exist, so you can apply either less or more of the white over the top, giving you complete control over the colors that show through underneath. Once we've got the background in place, we'll go back and we'll clean up the edges. Of course, we'll do so using the white pastel pencil as well as the black pastel pencil. As we're re-establishing the edges of the owl, we want to make sure that we don't create outlines. Instead, we just want to re-establish some of the edges that were lost when we develop the background. Of course, creating an outline around the owl would lead to unnatural results. With these finishing touches in place,
Our drawing of an owl created with pastel pencils is complete.